All right. All right. So thank you, Mr. Raul Martynek, CEO of DataBank. It's an absolute pleasure to speak with you. I think since you confirmed, I've been just so excited because your resume reads like um a highlight reel for Fortune 500 digital infrastructure companies. What you've done, it's so astonishing. So I felt let's just tease out, let's just unpack a lot of what you've done and also get some tips on how we can also navigate the local data infrastructure space. So we'll just start with the first question. So tell us a bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. Temi, and listen, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to reconnect with you and to be on the program. Look, I'll just tell you about my journey through the space. I've been kind of in, as I call it, internet infrastructure for about 27 years. Kind of got in at the advent of the commercial internet in the U.S. in the mid 90s, right? I mean, for young people like yourself, there was a time when there was no internet, right? And ultimately, it really started as a telecom revolution, during that time. But I've been working with financial sponsors over the last 27 years in the internet infrastructure space. Started in telecom, as I just mentioned. Then, worked on a fiber business in Europe for a couple of years. Worked at a cloud computing company at kind of the advent of the public cloud. Did a number of years of projects in sub-Saharan Africa. That's how obviously I got familiar with internet infrastructure in Africa in kind of the early 2010s. And then about the last 10 years, I've been more focused on data centers. So ultimately, I've seen, from the dial-up days to where we are today. And it's been an incredible journey and experience, working in the sector. And ultimately, I think it's still, believe it or not, in the early innings, right? Because ultimately, the way I think about internet infrastructure is, what does it do? It allows humans to consume technology. And my view is that humanity is addicted to technology. And if you believe in that, then you're going to, by definition, you're going to need, more fiber and more towers and more submarine cables and more data centers, right? Because ultimately that's the physical underpinning of technology adoption. And that's really what I think our sector does.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I think you covered a lot of things that I'm now going to ask you about. So internet infrastructure, your experience across that, and you have done all the verticals, data centers, fiber connectivity, and so on. So reductively, to simplify, for the purpose of people who don't know anything about the internet, what exactly is internet infrastructure? What exactly is internet? How does it work? And then now there are various components that you have also talked up, data centers and so on, cloud,
Sure.
fiber, subsea. What is the role of all these interconnected segments in the whole internet infrastructure space?
Sure. Yeah. So look, I mean, the definition of the internet is a network of networks, right? So ultimately, what internet infrastructure represents is the physical building blocks of the modern internet, right? If you think about your phone, you think about, when you're looking at something on your computer, how does that information get to that physical device, right? And ultimately, there's really 3 or 4 kind of components that, create the physical foundation for the internet, right? From a wireless perspective, it's cell towers, right? You drive around any place on Earth these days, and you see these cell towers, and that's kind of how radio signals get to your phone, right? When the cell tower, how does it get it back into the network? Well, that's where, as you know, fiber optic cables take place, right? Fiber optic, we call that terrestrial infrastructure. It's the connective tissue between, all these different locations that, allows the packets to move back and forth. And then ultimately, all that information has to reside somewhere, and that somewhere is a data center. When people talk about the cloud, and the cloud is this, thing, this amorphous thing that's up in the sky, Well, it actually is a physical thing. It's called data centers, right? The cloud is basically a collection of data centers. And then ultimately the world is obviously a connected, a connected network. How does information get between continents? And that's where these things called submarine cables, basically traverse the oceans, get laid on the ocean floors. And that's how, for the most part, information gets from North America to Europe, and from Europe to Africa, and from Africa to Asia, right? So those kind of three building blocks, data centers, data centers, submarine cables, fiber, and cell tower infrastructure, that's what we call internet infrastructure. And from a investor perspective, what's happened is, think about it, the internet started, like I mentioned, 25 years ago. There wasn't any of this stuff, right? Or in the early days of the internet, all this kind of infrastructure was funded by, kind of venture capital firms or private equity firms or hedge funds, people that tended to have kind of a short-term view around the asset life, right? And what's happened over the last 10 years, as the global investment community has realized that, hey, this infrastructure is no different than roads. It's no different than airports. It's no different than, docks or gas pipelines or, things like that. It's going to be around forever. And what's happened is infrastructure investors, and those are like the deepest pools of capital that exist, have now rotated into the space. So when you look at the landscape in a very mature market like the US or Europe, the vast majority of businesses like DataBank are owned by infrastructure funds, right? DataBank's largest investor is Swiss Life, which is a Zurich-based insurance company, along with EDF Invest, which is the French utility that owns all the nuclear power plants. And these people have, multi-decade type of time horizons where they look to, mature an investment. And again, it's a reflection of kind of an understanding from the investor community that this infrastructure is permanent and it's going to be around forever.
Great, thank you. And I like the very quick way you showed how everything is connected. Terrestrial infrastructure, fiber is connective tissue, storage are the data centers, and then sometimes content or information or whatever it is has to move across continents. And there you now have subsea cables. So I like to thank you for that, how you quickly connected it. So now to what you're now doing. So you have all this experience, and we'll sort of touch on a bit of fiber conversations, of how you run an ISP and so on, and all the other things you did. But now data centers. How did you get into the data center business, given that your academic background was non-technical? You had political science, and then you did international affairs. But now you have all your life, for over 27 years or about that, you have been in technology, and you've had a front row seat. Not the people, not really, and you don't have any technology. It's not like you have cloud ops or DevOps or anything in your resume. It's just the work you've done. So how you get into the industry, and how did you get specifically into data centers?
That's a great question. And it's funny, I have to dig way back because it happened a long time. But look, when I got out of college in the late 80s, it was really around the time of the PC revolution, right? It's when personal computers and software, kind of personal software, started to emerge, right? So my first job out of college, at that time, there was no IT department in companies because companies didn't have any computers. They didn't have any local area networks. They didn't have anything from a technology perspective. So, it was always something that interested me. And I started to, just kind of be the guy in the office that would come in on the weekend and unpack computers. And, back then you had to, load the operating system, DOS. You had to connect everything. You had to, put it together yourself. And I started to just, pursue an interest in that, and ultimately learned how to software, I learned how to program. I was working on database applications. There was one called Paradox at the time. When I got a job at a financial institution, I was kind of writing code, believe it or not, for internal applications. So so it all kind of, something that, came naturally to me and something that really interests me. So when I kind of by happenstance got involved in telecommunications in the mid 90s, and at the same time, the internet was emerging as this thing that at the time was separate, I was like, hey, listen, I recognize that. I understand, what's really happening there. So I kind of gravitated towards. So look, that was my foundation to be able to then, learn it, on the job. And, in the early days, I was with, a startup company, and I would go out and install, Cisco 2501 routers and Adtran TSUs and troubleshoot TCP IP and stuff like that. And I remember installing my first firewall, which was a Gauntlet. I remember it was the name of the, installing the firewall. So it was just something that, as you were an entrepreneur and as you kind of had to, as we like to say, you had to, kill what you eat. From a business perspective, it was something that I learned. And, fortunately, I've been, involved with the sector, since then. So I've been able to, increase my knowledge of what's going on there. And today, I don't spend any time doing all that, but it does that background and that foundation gives me an appreciation for, how this is going to evolve, right? Because one thing about the internet, if you think about it, the internet looked a lot different in 95 and in 2000 and in 2005 and in 2010 and 15 and 20. So the internet evolves, right? I like to say that the internet, it's kind of like the universe. It's a large scale structure that evolves over a certain set of rules and laws, right? And I think the internet's going to look a lot different in the future than it looks now, right? Because it's obviously evolved over the last 10, 20 years, right? And ultimately, it's that kind of understanding that informs my view around, as a data center, you asked, a data center business. I got into that, over the last 10 years. The data center sector evolution is really interesting, right? If you think about it, I remember in 1995, every office I would walk into had a data center, right? It was called a computer room. People would, put their IT infrastructure, again, PCs, servers came out, they would put it in their office, right? I mean, you would go into any office in Manhattan, the 88th floor of the World Trade Center, someone would open a room and there would be 2,000 square feet of white space with all this computer equipment in it, right? Looking back at it, it's crazy that we did that, but that's how it started. And what happened is, as that technology got more and more central to how businesses run, and today, obviously, you can't run a business without that technology, people realize this is too mission critical. I can't keep it in an office where the power can go out, where I can't put a generator on it, where a water pipe can burst on the floor above me and ruin it. And that's what created the impetus for people to move that infrastructure out of offices and into multi-tenant data centers like DataBank, right? So what DataBank is we're a data center operator. We build data centers where our customers, and we have 3,000 customers, place their most critical, critical assets, right? It's the IT equipment and the networking that, controls their data, that controls their applications, that controls their business, because there is no business of any significance in this world that is not 100% dependent on its digital footprint. And the data center is where that digital footprint lives.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So now still speaking data centers and DataBank, how many data centers do you have servicing your 3,000 plus customers? And then what sort of are they? So now, because of uptime, everybody is sort of tier 3, tier 4. What sort of tiering are those data centers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So today we operate the largest geographic footprint of data centers in the US. We have over 70 data centers in 26 US markets, right? Giving us the largest geographic footprint. It's over 300 megawatts of installed, as we say, UPS capacity. And it's over 2 million square feet of real estate across those 70 data centers. We have, obviously, as I just mentioned, you have in a lot of markets. And data centers, they're not all the same, right? They all serve slightly different purposes, right? There's a set of data centers in our portfolio which we consider these highly interconnected carrier hotels, right? There's a subset of data centers in the world that the predominance of internet traffic gets exchanged, right? If you think about, again, back to the internet, I mentioned it's a network of networks, right? You know, Bharti Airtel has a network, right? And Safaricom's got a network, right? And Orange has got a network, and MTM has a network. And obviously in the US, the same thing, and in Europe, right? Those are separate networks. They're run separately by those companies. But for you to make a phone call or exchange data between those two networks, somewhere those networks have to physically touch. And for the most part, what's happened with the evolution of the internet is there's a small number of locations where the networks built up critical mass, and then more networks came there. And now these are these critical interconnect points, right? So Terraco, if you remember them from South Africa before they got bought by Digital Realty, Terraco in Johannesburg had the main, as we call it, peering point in Johannesburg and in Cape Town. And they had 50 different, networks in that location. And that's where those networks physically, touched and where traffic got exchanged. So DataBank, we have about 18 of those locations. They tend to be older type of buildings, not purpose-built, because those buildings kind of got created during the dot-com bubble, in the mid-90s. But they are very, very valuable and very, very critical because they perform that function. Then we have, the other data centers are more, as we call them, enterprise class data centers. What happened was in the early days, as I mentioned, people would build data centers in any location. Then we realized, that doesn't really make sense. So then we would build master plan data centers where we basically buy land, we, design a data center, a blueprint from the ground up to be a data center, and then we build that out and then we lease it over time. And that's what the vast majority of our data centers are. They're these master planned, single tenant, purpose-built data centers that are only designed to, house critical IT gear and data and keep it 100% powered and 100% cooled and 100% safe, right? And in the US, to give you an example, obviously, in 95, there were, no multi-tenant data centers, right? I mean, some larger enterprises and companies like IBM had, generation one data centers, right? But, probably, the entire amount of megawatts that, that data centers occupied in the US in the mid-90s was probably like 100 megawatts, right? Today, there's 17 gigawatts of installed data center capacity in the US, right? So it just shows you how important and how, how much growth there's been in this space.
Okay. So thank you. You sort of talked around carrier hotels and how some data centers are different because some are meeting points for all operators. And then you talked about Terraco. By the way, Terraco has so their peering is NAP Africa, and they are doing significantly well.
Yep.
They're doing very well. So carrier hotels, and there are many terms around this where companies come and interconnect. Some say carrier hotels, some say meet-me rooms, some say internet exchanges, and so on. And then obviously there is the broad name that we use for all of them, data centers, right?
Correct.
But what is really, can you differentiate a meet-me room from a data center, from a carrier hotel, from an exchange? Where exactly are the unique nuances that differentiate them?
Okay. Well, listen, some of it is semantics and there are some differences, right? But first off, a data center, right? Every location that is a data center, and that's the biggest term, right? I mean, they all have the same kind of basic components, right? Obviously, it's physical real estate, right? It has what's called mechanical, electrical, and plumbing infrastructure, right? What's the purpose of a data center? To provide power on an uninterrupted basis. That's the electrical, right? The mechanical is the cooling, right? As we know, computer equipment generates a lot of heat. How do you cool that? You cool that with mechanical infrastructure, right? The plumbing is what connects it all together. So all data centers have power systems, UPSs, have generators, which is obviously what, backs up that power when the grid is no longer available. And it has cooling equipment to keep that space clear. You know, those other nuances, meet me room, carrier hotel, internet peering point. Peering is very specific to, let's call it voice traffic or internet traffic, right? You know, that is, you know, as you know, there's a whole group of either locations that are peering points or companies that focus on peering. So AMS, right? The Amsterdam Internet Exchange, they are a player that has opened up peering locations inside data centers in many, many markets. Same thing with DKIX, which is the Deutsche Internet Exchange. You know, we have them in the building I'm sitting in right now here in Dallas, right? So those are kind of, they serve a very specific function around the exchange of internet traffic, right? And there's voice peering points as well, right? A meet me room really is a word that is designed to signify a space within a data center where these networks can physically touch with each other, right? So people tend to use these terms interchangeably. There's some slight nuances behind it, but look, at the end of the day, if we really want to simplify things, because I think sometimes our space, you know, we use a lot of technical jargon, it just confuses the heck out of people when we don't need to do that, right? It's data centers, right? You know, I like to, you know, say that, you know, there are carrier hotels just because that's a term, right? And within those carrier hotels, there's meet me rooms and there's also internet exchanges. And maybe there isn't. You know, we have plenty of carrier hotels that don't have either of those, but they still serve the purpose of a meet me room, which is there's a lot of carrier networks there, as we say, a network ecosystem, and there's a lot of cross connects, right? Which the cross connects are the actual physical elements that we as a data center operator provide to connect network A to network B and vice versa.
Okay, I think that was very clear. All of them are data centers, but then we now have to segment what's based on use, I guess, based on function. Yeah. Okay, so you have over 70 data centers already in the US, and I'll come to another question of why you're now doubling down on just North America.
Yep.
And then you've just raised, and congrats on that, the announcement you made recently that you raised about $533 million to build new data centers. $533 million to build new data centers. So what are you saying that is sort of, what opportunities are you seeing that makes you want to quickly, okay, we need to ramp up the data center boom that we have, build more data centers. What are you seeing? And then how many data centers do you plan to build and where specifically?
Great. Yeah. So look, the data center space, you know, like, as I mentioned earlier, you know, really emerged right after the internet. And, you know, there's been, call it, three big drivers of data center development over the last 20 years. All right. Driver number one, I alluded to earlier, where, you know, we call it enterprise outsourcing, right? Enterprises had that data equipment in their own data center or on their premise, and they realized, you know what, we don't need to build a data center. It doesn't make sense. Let's outsource that. So over the last 15 years, you know, there's been all this kind of outsourcing from company-controlled data centers to third-party data centers. So that's trend number one. Trend number two is obvious. It's the public cloud, right? The public cloud as a platform really didn't exist in 2010, right? I was with a cloud computing company kind of competing in that space. You know, Amazon at that time, they didn't even break out their numbers because they were so small. So public cloud growth has been dramatic over the last 10, 15 years. And that has fueled the demand for data centers, because one of the things that people don't realize is the public cloud providers, Google, Microsoft, Oracle, AWS, yes, they build a lot of their data centers, but they outsource about 50% of it to people like DataBank because it's so expensive. And then the third trend, and it's a trend that kind of I alluded to as well at the beginning of our discussion, is, you know, technology adoption, right? The number of applications. If you think about how many more applications there are today than there were 10 years ago. I mean, the iPhone alone created just, you know, thousands of different applications that people have developed. that then need to run on data center, on computer equipment that then needs to go into a data center. So those three trends, which have been kind of in place since the beginning of the internet, have driven data center absorption. And in the last year, we obviously have seen the next technological wave, which is AI, right? And AI is a new type of technology, that's now being adopted, and all that technology has to go into a data center. So we're seeing, really unprecedented demand for data center capacity. I mean, we had our most successful year ever in terms of, as we call it, data center leasing, selling data center capacity to customers. And AI has been a big driver of that. It's really taken hold here in the US, and it's very, very early, but it's already making an impact from a demand perspective. So, I mean, we're building across 15 different markets right now, building from as small as, a 2 megawatt expansion in Seattle, as an example, to a 40 megawatt, build in Atlanta or in Ashburn, right? So a lot of capacity. We're currently building over 180 megawatts of new data center capacity to be able to deliver that to the market.
Thank you. So yes, I want to talk about AI now, because you have taken us there, and it's one of the questions I wanted to ask. And you're right, it's sort of becoming more than a buzzword. People are AI everywhere. We've seen the growth of ChatGPT, and then Google also is trying to get into it with Gemini, all the other players who are sort of getting into AI. And obviously, data centers will play a major role in this. So I want to ask the question about now AI. And then a lot of the messaging you have been saying now has been around this AI play. What are you seeing in terms? And thank you for what you said about AI is now sort of growing. And then you're trying to play in that. What will an AI data center look like? And how can operators who currently have data centers, they have already built their brick and mortar, or they have their modular data centers, how can they, is it possible to repurpose them for AI, or do they have to say, okay, no, this is going to be a dedicated AI data center, let's build this from ground up?
Yeah, no, great question. So, look, the way I would think about that is, we build data centers to support this equipment, and ultimately it's about something called power density, right? As you well know, if you go into a data center, you see all these racks, right, of equipment that's stacked in a rack. The question is, how much power as a data center operator can I deliver to that rack? Historically, 5 kW, 5,000 watts per rack would have been a decent and average number of power that you would deliver to a rack. Over the last couple of years, as equipment has gotten more powerful and more dense, that's crept up to, call it, 10 kW to 15 kW per rack. Again, something that with kind of traditional data center designs, most data center operators and most data center locations didn't have a problem supporting. AI is fundamentally different. The reason it's fundamentally different is because the GPUs, right, which, as you know, are predominantly made today by NVIDIA, are incredibly power hungry, right? A chassis, an H100 chassis from NVIDIA, which is 7-8U high, will by itself consume 10,000 watts per rack. So what we're seeing today is customers who are looking to deploy these GPU clusters to support AI applications like large language models, they're asking us for 30, 40, 50, 70 kW per rack. And that's where certain data center designs, depending on how they're designed, can't support it, right? But look, here's the good news, right? As I like to say, if you stop for a moment and visualize all the data center infrastructure in the world today, right? What is it doing? It's running the world today. It's supporting this Zoom call. It's supporting your access to Microsoft Azure. It's supporting your ability to, go to an airline website and book a flight. It's running the world today. As I said, AI is completely new. It is a new technological revolution. We can talk more about that. And those workloads are going to be deployed for the most part in newer data centers. And most newer data center designs, like what we do at DataBank, are designed to be able to support workloads of that density. So retrofitting an old data center is a tricky outfit, right? Why? Because it's kind of like retrofitting your house, right? If you design your house with a certain amount of electricity and a certain amount of rooms, and you all of a sudden want to change it all, well, it's going to be expensive, right? It's the same thing with an older data center, but there's still plenty of kind of more legacy workloads that need to be adopted, right? We still have digital transformation, we still have cloud adoption, we still have technology adoption. All that's going to still drive data center demand. But what we're seeing is these new AI deployments, the customers want them to be very dense, and they want us to deliver a lot of power in a very small footprint, which requires new cooling techniques, not air cooling, but water cooling. And that's what we're doing in a lot of our data centers. We've already deployed these types of solutions for years because we were supporting customers that had these type of high density, as we call it, needs. So in Atlanta and in Salt Lake and in the Ashburn, we had already kind of deployed high density type of solutions. So but now what we're seeing is a lot more demand for that. And I think, yes, what you're going to see over the next 5 to 10 years is that workloads are going to increase in density, and there's going to be more and more of these AI clusters deployed.
Okay, thank you very much, Raul. So you have doubled down on North America, US largely, and I know you used to have European assets. I remember you had in France. You sold everything to ETICS everywhere. What exactly happened there? Was it just so what were challenges you saw first of all there that made you think, okay, these other markets aren't working for me? Was it a market development issue? Was it was it a language issue? Was it a technology issue? What exactly happened that said, okay, let's pull out of this other market and just focus on US? And then another part of that question, maybe I should let you answer this, and then I'll talk about Africa.
Sure. Look, we acquired the French data center assets as part of an acquisition of a portfolio of assets in 2020. And at the time, we had, we acquired those 5 data centers, right? I mean, ultimately, the reason was it was just pure business opportunity, right? Ultimately, we said to ourselves, we have this incredible platform in the US with 70 data centers, 3,000 customers, 26 markets. And then we got this small platform in Europe with 5 data centers and 200 customers and not a lot of expansion capacity. So when we looked at, where do we think we can deliver the best return for our investors, investing $1 in Europe or investing $1 in the US, it was clear to us from a focus perspective and from a incremental opportunity perspective that investing in the US because of the scale that we had was a much better business decision. So it's not a reflection of, the European market or the opportunity there. Had we had a much deeper, initial configuration, we might have made a different decision and said, you know what, let's fund that too. But ultimately, that's the reason, Temi, we decided to focus on the US. It's just that incrementally, it just made a lot more sense for us than to invest in Europe.
Okay, thank you for that. Some of the drivers of data center growth you had mentioned earlier, you had talked about the growth in public cloud fueled by the demand. There's a growing demand for data centers thanks to public cloud. Technology adoption also is a big thing. There is more broadband in most countries of the world, especially outside Africa, the global north. But then global south, continents like Africa, countries like Nigeria, where the population is over 200 million, obviously there is a data center opportunity. Have you thought about looking outside to maybe Africa for
Well,
opportunity?
I certainly have personally. I mean, the whole Africa telecom sector is of real personal interest to me. I'm actually a personal investor in Kazi Cloud, which, as you know,
As it
is a
cloud.
data center
Okay.
platform that they're building in Lagos. So I'm a big believer in kind of Africa data center future. I mean, ultimately, the data center, by itself serves no purpose, right? In other words, a data center that's not connected to a broadband economy really can't serve its purpose, right? And ultimately, what I see as kind of the main thing that needs to continue to happen in sub-Saharan Africa is just the adoption of robust internet connectivity, right? Because ultimately, it's the ability of the population to be able to have access to broadband. And I'm not talking about having a phone that says 4G on there. I'm talking about having a phone that says 4G on there, but when it hits the tower, that tower is then connected to the core with a very fat pipe, right? Because otherwise, you don't have anything there. And certainly, as I mentioned, I spent a decent amount of time in sub-Saharan Africa up until about 2016, working in West Africa, in Cameroon, and certainly my experience there was, while there was competition, and MTN was there, and Orange, and we sold a mobile license to Viettel, and they were building out a network that fundamentally the internet experience for the most part was still poor, right? It was still it still wasn't ubiquitous. It still wasn't symmetrical. It still wasn't all over the country. It was tended to be concentrated in urban areas. And then you obviously need to connect Africa to the rest of the world, right? And on that front, the good news is when I started doing business in Africa in 2010, it was really the only cable was the Sat3 cable, right? And then Maine came and developed the cable, and after that, obviously Ace Cable and Wax Cable, and now there's been a number of other cable systems both on West Africa and East Africa that have been connected. But it's really that fundamental terrestrial fiber and maritime fiber that needs to be built out, and then you need to have a robust fiber capability, and that really lays the foundation for the ability to then deploy applications inside data centers so that it can be consumed by the local population, as opposed to, as a lot of the traffic originates and terminates on another continent. And that, again, I think, as more and more investment happens in African internet infrastructure, that will evolve and that will continue to progress.
Thank you very much for that, Raul. So now I want to get into some slightly non-technical, non-data center questions, maybe now about how you have been running the businesses you have as a serial CEO. So you have you have quite a lot of experience. You've been a serial CEO of data center or cloud or managed services, and you've worked across multiple continents. Virtual.net, NetAccess. You're currently CEO of one of the largest data center companies in North America. What would you say are the key pillars that have helped you suddenly immerse yourself into a role and then you quickly get profitable, or quickly improve, not get profitable, quickly improve the fortunes of the company and just keep going and expanding and growing and everything? What exactly has helped you successfully be the type of CEO who gets into a place and then you shake things up and then you build the sort of business that investors now want to invest in and acquire and all those things? What has guided you?
That's a good question. Well, look, I mean, look, I think number one, it all starts with people. People, I'm an ex football player, and I think business and sport is very, very similar, right? I mean, ultimately, when you look at the best teams that are out there, right? They're not composed of egotistical individuals. They're a team, right? So, and they and no one and everyone has to play their part, right? So, I mean, when I I've always been someone that's looked at business as from that perspective, right? So, I feel like my role is to make sure that the folks that I have on my team are of the highest quality, right? I mean, I have my own philosophies that I've picked up over the years in terms of how to do that. There's a book called Top Grading, which I think is one of the best business books that's out there that tells you, how to identify talent, right? How to create a business, that's based on what are called A players, right? And what's the definition of an A player, right? So I think it all starts with individual talent, right? But individual talent only gets you so far, right? Because ultimately, a company is a collection of individuals. And if you can't figure out how to organize and motivate and align those individuals to accomplish a goal, well, again, you're going to be like a sports team that has a whole bunch of individuals, but that they don't know how to play together, right? And that's kind of a way where again there's a good book called Good to Great by Jim Collins, which talks about level 5 leadership, and I see you smiling, so I know you know it. There's another book called Mike Lucione's The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I try to, create an environment where, we hire great people, and then we empower those people by giving them clear priorities and by, giving them clear definitions of what's successful and what isn't, right? I mean, a lot of the businesses that, I've seen that are struggling, it's, they claim they want to get great people and they claim they have priorities, but at the end of the day, they don't, right? And one thing about our sector is, even though we're talking about all these kind of real assets, right? And, data centers and fiber and towers, I mean, ultimately, this is an execution business, right? That if the best companies, the companies that go the farthest, are the ones that that understand how to deliver results and understand about performance and out execute their competition, right? There's an African proverb, right? It says, you want to go fast, go alone. You want to go far, go together, right? And ultimately, that's the type of environment I try to create within the company. And fortunately, I've had the honor and the pleasure to work with really, really great people. And a lot of the people on my team, I've worked with at previous companies, right? So multiple times. I've had my head of sales. This is the 4th company we've worked at together, right? So we understand, how to each other, and we understand how to, help ourselves create mutual success, right? So there's, and then the other piece now in this business is, you need to obviously have access to capital. You can't build data centers. I mean, this is, a multi-billion-dollar business where you're investing hundreds of millions or billions of dollars per year building out data centers, right? So you need to have an investor group, like I described earlier, that can support you over the long term, and that is willing to make those investments that take years to pay back, right? So there's a whole bunch of different things there, but look, ultimately it starts and ends with people, right? That's ultimately people. Mark Ganzi, the CEO of Digital Bridge, he has a famous saying, people create alpha, right? Which is a fancy word for people create outcomes, right? Alpha is from investing, right? That's returns, right? But it is so true. It's like, it's great people that create great outcomes, and identifying those great people and getting them on your team and organizing them as a team and motivating them and creating, a vision of the future is kind of what creates the result.
That's very profound. It's just people. Getting the right people, getting the best people, empowering them to do all they have to do. Okay, thank you very much, Raul. There's another question there, sort of a twist of the last. So now you have run successful companies. but you have also, in many roles that you have played, you have helped restructure, you have helped lead some of these companies, and then they just get acquired. So you have, when you were at Smart Telecom, you worked there, they got acquired by DigiWeb, you worked at Net Access, they were well positioned to be acquired by Apologit. You also did Voxel, they were acquired by Internap. You worked at Info Highway, they were acquired by Broad Networks. You are like the king of acquisitions, of telco acquisitions. What exactly is the key to attracting acquisitions? What's obviously the sort of role you have had the infrastructure fund advisor role where you have look at infrastructure projects. I'm sure you have applied this into the sort of companies that you have also helped grow, and then you now make them very attractive for acquisition. But what exactly is the key to attracting the right eyeballs for acquisition?
That's a great question. I mean, and you might find my answer kind of surprising. And my answer is I never really think about the exit. Okay. I think about building a great company. If you build a great company, the exit comes, right? And again, I think a lot of entrepreneurs are too focused on envisioning what that exit is and who it's going to be. And they forget about what creates value. What creates value is a great business, right? It's a business that's growing. It's a business that has happy customers. It's a business that has happy employees, right? Because employee engagement is so important to results. It's a business that's performing and delivering its numbers. I mean, ultimately, if you do that, then guess what? As I like to say, the exit comes, right? I mean, you mentioned obviously a bunch of the situations I've been involved with, and those exits were really a function of the investor base, right? If you think about and step back, what I said earlier about how this sector evolved, where early on it was private equity, it was early stage investors. I mean, those types of investors, they basically raise a pool of capital, a fund, right? And that fund typically has a 10 or 12-year period to it, it's a life, right? And then they spend their first 5 years investing in companies, and then their next 5 years harvesting or exiting companies because they need to return money to their limited partners, their LPs, right? So all those situations that you described, were under those types of circumstances where I was brought in either at a business that was, already running or a business that was kind of broken, and I had to turn the business around or stabilize it or grow it. And then because they were looking to get their money back, we had to run a process and sell it. I mean, that's what I like best about what we're doing here at DataBank. I mean, today, we're owned by, DigitalBridge, which is a public entity, and the investors I mentioned, Swiss Life, EDF, Canadian Pensions Fund. We're not in any vehicle. DataBank exists as what's called an SPV. It's an independent company. It's got its own governance. It has no timeline. We have no fuse, as I like to say, on our life cycle, right? We can, as long as we continue to create value for investors, this company can continue. We're really like a permanent company, right? And that's really, to me, very satisfying because, I enjoy, what I do. And it's hard to build a business and to assemble a team and to create, and to create that alignment. And then, being and sell into someone else, great. Financially, it's a good outcome, but it's not necessarily satisfying from a personal perspective, right? So anyway, that's kind of, the way it works. And, turnarounds are tough, right? I mean, I've had a number of turnarounds in my career, dating back to when I first got the CEO role and in telecom. I was the COO and then got promoted to be the CEO of the business that, was not doing well at the time. And, that requires extra energy, right? It's like anything in life. Once the flywheel starts moving, it's a lot easier to keep going. But, getting the flywheel to move from a standing start or from a negative start is a lot tougher. But in any event, those are some of my thoughts on that.
And thank you so much, Raul. Another buzzword that seems to be catching on is this green and sustainability and green data centers. It's even coming into data centers. But how exactly would green data centers work? What do you see there? Are they real green data centers? Because I assume one of the things you have talked about is the huge computing power requirements. And in terms of green, obviously we have to look at alternate energy sources. I don't know if those alternate energy sources can necessarily right now power the sort of huge computing. But what exactly do you see that what's happening? And are we really going to, when do you see green data centers going mainstream?
Yeah. Yeah. No, listen, that's obviously given climate change. And, I do believe that, that's a real issue for humanity, that, there needs to be this element in our roadmap, right? I mean, green data center is kind of a misnomer. I mean, ultimately, we're dependent on the electric grid, right, to power our data center. But fortunately, what's happening, and certainly here in the US, I know in Europe and in other parts of the world, is there's a lot of new renewable energy generation that's being installed around the world, right, to create, more power, right? And what we're starting to see, at least here in the US, is the ability for us as a data center operator who's building a data center, for the most part in a dense urban market. But the utilities that are supplying us the power, they're accessing that green energy, either wind or solar, or offshore, and they're able to bring it to us. So, for example, in our Atlanta 4 data center, the same data center that you mentioned where we announced the financing, that entire data center, all 40 megawatts, is we opted into a 100% renewable solar solution for that. So all the power that we're going to be consuming with that data center coming from Georgia Power is going to be renewable, right? And that I think is how the sector gets there. I mean, we're not like Google or Microsoft where we build a data center in the middle of a very large flat area and then put up a solar farm, because guess what? They're building that data center for themselves. Remember, we're building the data center for other customers, and our other customers don't want to drive 500 miles to some remote location where you could put a solar farm. They're in an urban area like New York or Los Angeles or Chicago, right? But what we're seeing here in the U.S. at least is a significant improvement in the options that we as a data center operator have to be able to procure renewable power.
Okay, great, great. Thank you. We just a few days ago, we spoke to the CEO of Subsea Cloud. So what she does is she runs Maxi Reynolds. She runs underwater data centers. So she puts her data centers in water. What do you find? Do you find that interesting?
Listen, I think that's obviously it's interesting, it's novel. I mean, ultimately, I think there's some serious limitations to that. Look, you put it underwater. Why do you do that? Well, because you can use the cold water to cool it, right? But you still got to power it, right? And ultimately, data center efficiency is getting to the point where we can run very, very efficient. It's measured by something called PUE. We can run extremely efficient just using, technologies that we can use above water, right? So I think, that's something that probably will have some application in some amount of use cases, but ultimately it isn't going to be a meaningful thing because, guess what? It's really expensive to put a big data center underwater. And ultimately, you're going against what your customers want, which is they want a affordable solution.
Thank you. So now to the lighter part. So you have a lot of work. You're now building new data centers everywhere. You're raising funds for that. You're traveling to a lot of places. What do you do to relax? What's your favorite, aside the relaxing question, so what's your favorite pastime?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I obviously I have four beautiful children and my wife, so my family is my favorite pastime. But if I had to pick another one, it's football. All right, I've been to 8 World Cups, in my life, including South Africa in 2010 and Qatar just recently in 2022. I'm going to the Euro Cup next year. I'm
France.
originally I was born in Spain. I'm actually still a Spanish citizen, so I'll be supporting La Roja. So I love watching football and traveling for football. That's my passion.
All right. Thank you so much, Raul. It's been a great pleasure speaking to you, and the conversation has really been insightful. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Temi. I really appreciate you having me. Thanks a lot.
So let me stop recording.